Former champion Alex Volkanovski will be taking on number 3 ranked Diego Lopez for the vacant UFC featherweight title. Topuria has felt like he's done all that he can in that division, and he feels like he's cemented his legacy, and his body cannot make the weight anymore. So Topuria will be moving up to 155 pounds and will be vacating the featherweight title. So the way that this works is, as soon as the first punch is thrown in this fight, the title is vacated. And we will announce what Topuria's next fight will be when we get it done.
So, Dana White just did a live stream where he announced some massive fights. And, well, it's right in the thumbnail, right? Ilia Topuria is vacating the belt, and Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopez will be fighting for the vacant featherweight title. Now, I don't think anybody was expecting this news. From what I could tell, even those who wanted Ilia Topuria to move up and fight Islam Makhachev wanted him to do so after defending the belt 1 or 2 more times. Personally speaking, I would have wanted Ilia to beat Lopez, Movsar, and Volk a second time before moving up to lightweight to cement himself as an all-time great featherweight. But it looks like he's trying to take the Conor McGregor route to greatness. Another big fight that Dana White announced during his livestream was Jack Della Maddalena versus Bilal Muhammad for the main event of UFC 315. And Sean Brady is going to be filling in for Jack Della Maddalena as Leon Edwards' opponent for UFC London. There were a couple other big fights that were announced as well for UFC 314, like Piglet versus the Jordan Peele movie villain as the co-main event, Carlos Prates versus Geoff Neal, and Yair Rodriguez versus Patricio Pitbull. Also, for the Canada card, UFC 315, they're putting Shevchenko versus Fiora on there because they know that Canadians are the only fan base that will consistently accept WMMA co-main events. However, this video is mostly going to be about Volk versus Lopez, because that's the fight that is probably the most important out of all of the ones that were announced. The fight between Volkanovski and Diego Lopez being made is incredibly significant, and I think people might only start seeing the full ramifications of this move by the UFC months from now, because this fight being announced has big implications for the title picture at featherweight, lightweight, and welterweight. But first, I'd like to quickly break down this fight. Personally, I think Volkanovski is going to win by decision or 4th or 5th round TKO. Diego Lopez has slowed down considerably in the later rounds of his fights, albeit the Ige and Movsar fights were on relatively short notice. If you're picking Lopez to win this fight, you're basically picking him to win by KO in the first 2 rounds, which I don't see happening against Volk. Volkanovski has historically done the best against opponents who are taller than him, and struggled against shorter opponents. Volk's toughest opponent at featherweight prior to Ilia was Chad Mendes, who hurt Volk a few times in that fight with his boxing. And if you go back to the Ilia fight, you would know that Volkanovski looked good in the first round, fighting at range and outpointing Ilia on all of the judges' scorecards. If Volk isn't completely washed, I could see him outlasting Lopez and dragging him into deep waters. And we know from the Ortega and the first Islam fight that Volk is basically unsubmittable, so Lopez really needs an early knockout to win this fight. The only weapon that I would be worried about if I were Volkanovski is Diego Lopez's uppercuts, since they're Lopez's best punches and are well suited to countering Volk's head movement. But also, even though I'm predicting Volkanovski to reclaim the belt, and even though I'm a bigger Volkanovski fan than I am a Lopez fan, in some ways I'd prefer that Lopez win this fight. If Volkanovski were to reclaim the belt, it would feel incredibly hollow in a way. It'd be very similar to the situation with Jose Aldo and the featherweight title while Conor was fighting Nate Diaz and Eddie Alvarez. The prestige of the featherweight belt was significantly reduced when Jose Aldo rematched Frankie Edgar for the interim belt at UFC 200 and was subsequently promoted to undisputed champion once more. The same problem applies to Francis Ngannou vacating the heavyweight championship and going to the PFL, letting the drug fiend and a Frenchman with negative wrestling ability fight over the vacant title. The UFC title is a symbol that means the man who holds this belt is the greatest in the world at this weight class. Sure, Ilia Topuria would now be at 155 pounds, but wouldn't it leave a sort of void in the credibility of the UFC featherweight title if Volkanovski were to reclaim it? Even though Topuria is saying that his body can no longer make featherweight, we just saw him make championship weight at UFC 308. If you know anything about bodybuilding, you'd know that the human body isn't suddenly going to pack on 10 pounds of extra muscle in 4 months. Especially if you've already got a lot of muscle like Ilia does. Topuria could probably still make featherweight if he really tried, and if he were to rematch Volkanovski, most people would predict that Volkanovski would get knocked out again. So although I think Volk is going to win, Lopez getting the belt might be better for the overall health of the division moving forwards. That is, unless Volkanovski rematches Ilia at some point in the future, but there's no telling if that will happen at this point. Now moving on to what this fight being made means for lightweight and welterweight, this allows the UFC to make the biggest fight in the promotion that isn't the unification of the heavyweight title between Tom Aspinall and the duck of domestic abuse, drug use, and drunk driving. But personally, I don't know if we should be making that fight. And it's because, honestly, I feel kind of bad for Islam Makhachev. Islam has cleared out his division with the exception of Arman, and Arman is going to need to win 1 or 2 more fights before he's allowed to fight for the title again because of what he did at UFC 311. Personally, I think Islam has already surpassed Khabib as the greatest lightweight in UFC history, and should be given a chance to fight for the welterweight belt. But the problem with welterweight is that, well, there are just so many deserving contenders at that weight class. First of all, there's the fight between Belal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena that will be headlining UFC 315. But Dana White also said that after Shavkat is recovered from his injury, they will be letting him fight for the title. If Sean Brady beats Leon Edwards, he needs to get a title shot. If Kamaru Usman versus Joaquin Buckley gets made, and Buckley wins, Buckley is going to need a title shot. Furthermore, Islam and Belal are training partners, meaning that unless JDM sleeps Belal, Islam is not going to be fighting for the welterweight strap anytime soon. And besides, just think about it. Wouldn't it be pretty fucking ridiculous if you had a cage fight between Islam and Muhammad? Just saying. So, what are the options out there for Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria? The obvious one would be for them to fight each other, which I can see happening as the main event for International Fight Week or an Abu Dhabi card. Now, if they were to fight, I'd actually be picking Ilia Topuria. Islam was getting tagged up in the boxing by Dustin Poirier and was getting dropped by Volkanovski in their first fight. If Islam were to strike with Ilia, he'd have to be spamming body and head kicks to try and catch Ilia and wear down his arms, which is what Volk was doing against Ilia in the first round of their fight. But of course, you can't keep someone like Ilia at bay forever, especially since Ilia and Islam are going to be in an open stance, which takes away calf kicks as a viable weapon for reducing Ilia's mobility. And Islam's grappling style is reliant on getting his opponent to the cage. This means that if he were to grapple, he'd be getting the fight to exactly where Ilia wants the fight, which is also up against the cage. As a result, if Ilia were able to defend the takedowns, which I think he can because his background is not in boxing, but in Greco-Roman wrestling and jiu-jitsu, he'd have Islam right where he wants him for boxing exchanges. Now, if Islam were to sit out for a while and wait for the winner of UFC 315, I could see him getting a matchup against Jack Della Maddalena, depending upon how Shavkat's injury is healing up and how Sean Brady versus Leon Edwards goes. If Jack Della beats Belal, I'd pick him to knock out Islam. Even though JDM isn't a huge welterweight, if he shows that he can defend against Belal's takedowns, I'd choose him to beat Islam. Even though JDM is nowhere near as technical in his grappling as Islam, his boxing is on par with that of Ilia, and honestly, in some ways, JDM is better, considering he can fight out of both stances. However, that is all contingent on JDM beating Belal, and I see that fight as a 50-50, which all comes down to JDM's takedown defense. However, if I were to talk about some other possible matchups, I'd say a rematch between Charles Oliveira and Islam and a fight between Ilia and Arman would be good as well. I'd pick Islam and Ilia to win those fights, with my reasoning being that Islam already beat Charles, and Ilia having much better boxing than Arman, but those would be entertaining fights as well. Also, I'm adding this in as a little addendum at the end, but now that Ilia Topuria has vacated the title, we now might see Merab moving up at some point. Merab has already cleared out his division, and if he gets another defense against Petr Yan or Sean O'Malley, I think it'd be fine for him to fight for double champ status. So yes, we might see some crazy matchups being made around June or July of this year, and this honestly has got me incredibly hyped for what's to come next. If you enjoyed this video, please like and sub. Goodbye.